VoyMonk video voice vlog Friday. Yeah, started out this week talking about content over production rather than production over content. And I think if a lot of what people have seen out of a lot of production is evidence, I think that probably makes a lot more sense than people know. And I think if you go on YouTube and you do a lot of searching about, for me, I was looking up, different equipment and how to produce vlogs in general. The algorithm will steer you towards a lot of information and content from those who have a lot of different ideas of what you should and should not do. Mostly having to do with production. Many of it, sponsors and production and really expensive equipment and that sort of thing on how to do this. And I can say that, just as I mentioned before, there's the production. It doesn't mean there's a whole lot of content. That's, at least for me, what I'm looking for. I mean, for me, when I'm looking for content, I'm looking for the person who's probably got a potato for what some people might call a video camera. But, they're not self-deluded, they're self-aware enough, but they want to produce and have the courage to make some content that's really about themselves. And if they could stick with it, if, they do, a lot of times people don't because it's just not something that suits them. But my main point is that I don't know that there's any one right way to do things. I know that there are certainly ways that are pretty common. And as someone who's got the background in radio, broadcasting, I think there's obviously the cookie cutter method. But I think another thing that's kind of evolved, because there's a lot more people doing content, there sometimes are characters or templates or, show ideas rather than actual individuals that, in my opinion, are producing things that I at least find interesting. And it's tough because, as I've mentioned before, audiences, I would say, are a wild tiger, for a lack of a better description. And, you don't always know exactly what an audience is. And that's kind of one of the first rules that at least I learned while going to radio broadcasting school, and that you need to know your audience. And if you study communications, as I said, it's probably something that's pretty common as well, as far as marketing, advertising, and things like that. But for me, like I said, if you don't have the looks, you don't have the money, you don't have the 3 to 10 seconds that people will be engaged and interested, you might get looked over quite often. And that is what it is. And what I am pointing to when it comes to that is that, when it comes to what honestly does engage people, as far as if you have the money, if you have the production behind you and whatever, and you spitball, hit or miss, and it's usually many times a miss, you can create something that's ultimately more about projection and what people make out of it, as opposed to there being any, I would say, authentic substance that's involved in whatever is actually being produced. So that's why I say content over production. And image is important. I've mentioned that as well. And I've talked about the things that I care about and what I want. Like I said, I mentioned money being a motivator, ego as far as self-adulation being another, but also I mentioned, being creative and actually wanting to explore and find things to engage with others in a creative and constructive way. But those aren't the only 3 things that there are. There are plenty of other reasons and motivations, and I don't think I could say any one or more are superior. I can say that, at least in my experience, that for the most part, everything that I've seen and known and kind of experienced thus far has led me to believe that if you can actually create content that people do find interesting, or you can connect with people in a way that I think actually becomes something meaningful, then the other stuff it doesn't necessarily mean to or seem to be all that important. Because I've also watched from the other end where people they'll follow the advice, they'll do the things that are kind of seem like they're easy to do and ideas, but in actual reality, you can only maintain an illusion of something for so long until eventually you start to have some questions in your own mind, that subconscious part of yourself asking what you do. And I can say that I've been around, at least on YouTube, long enough to say that I've watched a few different circumstances where that kind of thing has happened, and it always made me kind of question, what was ever real to begin with. And I can't say that happened for the most part from the ground up with me. I mean, there have been a couple of situations where I watched and seen a channel grow, but most of the times it's usually not. I would say that the frustration that a lot of times will set in usually comes from fatigue, from things like over-promising and under-delivering. Sometimes it's trying to capitulate and say exactly what everyone wants to hear or anyone wants to hear and wind up finding that no one wants to hear it. And it isn't necessarily because that's wrong. It's just sometimes things just don't work for certain people. Some things just don't work at all. I would say probably if you have, looks, if you have money, if you have something that people ultimately want to obtain in life, that'll probably get you pretty far on especially some platforms. But, as far as you scratch beyond the surface of that, and they're just human beings like anyone else. No one is perfect. And I think most people know that, but when people project, it's kind of hard for that to be said that isn't something that people are left with. And so, yeah. For the most part, like I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be all one way, and it can be sometimes several different ways all at once as well. I just can say what I enjoy, what I look for when it comes to content that, maybe other people don't necessarily realize is far more interesting sometimes than they appreciate. I think one of the vlogs that I used to watch was a guy who suffered from, I believe, antisocial anxiety. He was a guy in the UK or whatever. He did a great vlog. I mean, it wasn't flashy or anything like that. He definitely seemed to struggle. I think I remember the name, but I don't want to put it out there because I think this particular individual decided to stop doing the vlogs. And I don't know particularly why. Maybe there was some other issues that came about and stuff. But he essentially did them mostly because he was struggling with his antisocial and anxiety and depression. Some issues that I have in a great deal. However, I don't think that he had a background in any kind of radio broadcasting or anything like that, but he did a great vlog, man. I found it extremely interesting. I don't think that he felt that same way about himself, and I think that was kind of the unfortunate part of, the thing that he was dealing with. I don't think that has to be solely the reason why, but sooner rather than later, he eventually kind of stopped wanting to do it. And of course, if you couple with that the fact that, people would respond to him and, they would have these certain kinds of expectations and things like that, One of the things that I've kind of found that he did, but it wasn't something that was all too uncommon, which is he did kind of build a somewhat of a following. And this is, I'm going to say, probably around the earlier days of YouTube, maybe about 2008-ish. And so, there wasn't like the millions and billions of people that were, a possible, audience. It was maybe a few 100,000, maybe a few million, but that was pretty much it. So he gained, it wasn't to the point that I don't think one would monetize and commercialize it in any way or whatever, however YouTube maybe decides to do that. But it was successful and people watched it and whatever. But I think it overwhelmed him. I think that was kind of part of it as well. And, he thanked a lot of the people that were responding and engaging, and many people just, they offered, kind words of encouragement and things of that nature. But the thing is that myself having major depression, major anxiety, and, ADHD, man, I could kind of see and I could kind of sympathize with the things that he was going through and he was talking about, and he was doing a great job in articulating. But I don't know how much help he actually had. I mean, he was climbing the mountains, but I think he was also still having the struggles. And I don't know that the particular thing that he was doing was entirely helpful. And there's nothing to blame. Like I said, I don't know, I don't know who else might have reached out to him or whatever. I know that when I seen the comments and things that people would leave, everything I saw was supportive. I think some were a little bit kind of pushy, and the fact that he had times where he put videos up, and then he had times that there were gaps, and people I think would kind of make mention of that. And I'm not sure how he took that. I mean, it seemed to be okay or whatever, but I think maybe it was fatigue. Maybe he realized he just didn't want to do it. Maybe there were some other things that were happening. But like I said, I was so captivated by the fact that this man was literally he was doing what he could do. He was sharing a glimpse into his life, and I thought it was so interesting. But I also kind of had a bit of sadness, the fact that I think he kind of became a bit successful, even to his detriment a little bit, because towards the end he said that he was going to stop doing it. He didn't just abruptly stop totally at first. He seemed to kind of mention that he was having some success, and while he thanked, people that were sending him messages, he seemed to kind of suggest that he would kind of wish people would stop asking him certain things, or, kind of, bleeding on certain expectations and whatnot. And it made sense, I mean, he didn't want to be rude because people were obviously trying to show him kindness, but at the end of the day, he still, just like anyone and everyone else, had problems. And to do this kind of format, to do anything even remotely like this, there's things that you have to do. I mean, if you really want to make it take it under and make a commitment. And so the point that I'm making by talking about this experience with YouTube and this content creator is that I think there's a few pitfalls that kind of can happen, along with some of the other things I've talked about, production over content, about not being authentic and being who you are, being careful about how, you cater to whatever audience if you're trying to make it a show rather than being who you are, because those kinds of things can backfire. That audiences are a wild tiger. They're not necessarily good, not necessarily bad, but you don't necessarily always know exactly what they want, even if you think you do. And in the case of the vlogger I was talking about, he was, he was grateful for the audiences and the intentions that he got. But I think he also realized that came with some expectations as well. And I've seen other vloggers do that as well. Sometimes people, especially if it's someone who's young, good looking, sometimes they get a lot of attention from certain people, and then they realize not all attention is good attention. Some of that attention can kind of wear off. Sometimes the expectations, like with the first gentleman I mentioned, can be too much. And of course, as a response to sometimes initially success, what people will do is they'll go over the top by saying that they love everybody and as a want to show appreciation. Sometimes what'll happen is maybe they'll express and articulate things that aren't quite as true as they think they are about people that they don't know. General public, this is content that goes out to just about anyone. Anything could and sometimes does happen. So, while you want to be authentic, sometimes the name you choose, sometimes the topics that you'll bring up, they can be terrifying. And that's what I mean in terms of courage and all that kind of stuff. When you see things that have a lot of production behind them, there are certain pitfalls, especially if it's a professional company. And I'm not saying it's a good or a bad thing. This might be a good thing that they avoid altogether, meaning in terms of certain things that you should or shouldn't do when it has to do with dealing with the public. And only because, some of these bigger production companies are doing very specific things in order to appeal to demographics and all that kind of stuff to be successful, because ultimately maybe for them it's about making money and selling. So like I said, these are some examples of the things that I'm talking about. There's many different ways to do content, and I'm speaking mostly this Friday about the content that I enjoy and why. Like I said, it's probably not going to be the most conventional kinds of content, because there's movies, there's TVs. Like I said, I've had lots of experience with that throughout my years, and of course now we're in the 2025, and we're experiencing content unlike anything else before. And as I've said before, the thing that I find the most interesting are as true today as they were when YouTube first started, which is different than traditional TV or other kinds of content. But I definitely love and like that ability for people who are willing and want to do it. And sometimes it is successful. Visual Sounds One is a perfect example of someone who I think has really developed as from the very first ASMR that I saw her do to, she's expanded into various different forms of art and content, and she's great at it. And, I'm not saying that it hasn't come without its, consequences or whatever. I don't think she's ever spoken about it, but she does great content, and I love it, and I still enjoy it to this day. And, like I said, and I would say if there's anyone that I would like to emulate, it would be her. But honestly, she's been doing it for so many number of years, like a lot of other art, like Gentle Whispering is another one. Maria, she's done content for many years, and not only is she developed, and she has quite a production now, even before that, the quality of her content is only matched by where it is today, because she's done such great. And like I said, Visual Sounds One is the other. There's a few others that I think I've kind of mentioned. And I like ASMR because it helps me relax. Like I said, my depression, anxiety, and ADHD, those are tools that I use. But as a result, Gentle Whispering, for example, she was one of those people that, in my mind, helped elevate an entire genre of kinds of content and entertainment and ways of doing things, especially on YouTube. Some in the more controversial aspects, but I think some people have always kind of felt that ASMR is a bit weird sort of content. But yeah, so like I said, yeah, that's what I've been meaning to talk about this week. And when I started this week, I kind of planned on making a point in each of my vlogs, and I wanted to kind of wrap it up doing it this way. So yeah, like I said, as far as I've talked about the comedy that I've liked. I've talked about other forms of entertainment, but I wanted to specifically talk about this form of entertainment, being YouTube, and that experience that I have, and of course where my inspirations come from. And hopefully, if you're listening, and whether this is your first time or this might be a couple of vlogs, video voice vlogs that you're in, I welcome you and thank you for listening. And hopefully you are here because you like who I am or whatever it is you're hearing, and you like to see this develop, and become something as far as bigger, and participate in the community. That, as I've said before, that is the other part of what I'd like to do with this channel, is build a community of other people that probably want to do things like this. And part of the big reason why is that because YouTube has gotten so big, I think sometimes it's actually kind of difficult to find some of the content over some of the stuff that YouTube has kind of evolved to now, which is a lot of content. But even with the algorithm, I think it's a little difficult sometimes to get to. So, but yeah, that's gonna do it for this Friday vlog. Hopefully you liked what you heard this week. Like I said, I'll be on next week. So until then, take care.